Hello lovers. Eleanor here. Tonight, we will embark on a journey that begins, as it often does for me, in the silence of this old house. The clock ticks with a stubborn rhythm, and the kettle hums in the kitchen. But the rooms themselves feel empty. So empty they echo even when I whisper to myself. Loneliness has a strange way of magnifying sound. You hear the creak of every floorboard, the sigh of every draft slipping through the window frame. At times I wonder, is this solitude my crown? Or my prison? It is a question that another woman, centuries before me, might have asked herself, though her crown was not metaphorical. Hers glittered with jewels, and yet it weighed heavier than iron. Elizabeth Tudor. Elizabeth I. The Virgin Queen. A woman who carried the burdens of a kingdom on her shoulders and cloaked her solitude in the shining mantle of power. I picture her as a young girl. Bright eyes wide but already cautious. Already learning that survival meant silence and quick wit. Her mother, Anne Boleyn, had been executed before Elizabeth turned 3. Imagine that. Your first memories forming in the shadow of a scaffold. How could such a beginning not shape the rest of one's life? I sometimes think of my own childhood. And though I lost my parents in my later years, I at least had the blessing of their warm hands when I was small. Elizabeth never did. She learned early that affection could vanish in a blade's swift descent. She was declared illegitimate, stripped of her status, shuffled aside as though she were nothing. And yet, there she remained, watching, absorbing, biding her time. There is a certain strength in those who survive neglect. They become observers, masters of reading the room, slipping through dangers by noticing what others overlook. Sometimes I sit in my chair by the fire, tracing the lines of my own solitude. And I think of Elizabeth in her cold chambers at Hatfield, the walls whispering with rumors that her very blood was tainted. She learned to craft a mask. And perhaps that is where her story connects so closely with my own. When you live alone long enough, you, too, begin to fashion a mask. Not to deceive others, but to protect the tender part of yourself that cannot bear to be wounded again. When she was just a teenager, Elizabeth was drawn into dangerous intrigues. Under her half-sister Mary's reign, she was suspected of treason, imprisoned in the Tower of London, waiting, day after day, for the sound of boots on stone that might mean her death warrant had been signed. Can you imagine being only 21, standing at the barred window of the tower, wondering if each sunrise would be your last? The cold stone pressing against your palm. The silence pressing harder still. And yet she lived. She endured. She carried that loneliness like armor. And in time, it became her strength. It makes me wonder. Is loneliness always a curse? Or can it sometimes be a crucible, burning away our weakness until only steel remains? Elizabeth's early years remind us that power and fragility often grow side by side. For me, sitting here with only my memories for company, I find a strange kinship with her. My crown is invisible, fashioned of books stacked high in the quiet dignity of keeping myself upright when no one is looking. Hers was a crown heavy with diamonds, yet equally lonely. Different worlds. Same silence. And so, lovers, as we follow her steps from a discarded child to a queen who would command armies and outwit empires, I invite you to reflect. How much of who we become is born not from love, but from the absence of it? If you enjoy these journeys through time, don't forget to hit the like button and subscribe to the channel. And please, share with me in the comments a story from history that has always touched you. perhaps one that whispers to your own solitude. Now, settle in comfortably. Close your eyes. And let's travel back in time with Eleanor. There are nights when I sit here, the lamp casting its soft halo across these yellowed pages, and I feel the echo of another prisoner's heartbeat. No, not mine. Though my solitude sometimes feels like a prison. But Elizabeth's, confined within the Tower of London. Her fate suspended on the whim of her half-sister Mary. Imagine it. The air damp and heavy. Walls slick with centuries of sorrow. Ravens circling outside as though waiting for a soul to devour. Elizabeth was 21. Scarcely more than a girl. And already she had lived through betrayals that would have shattered most. Her very presence was a threat to Mary Tudor, who burned with her own fears and insecurities. And in those flames, Elizabeth nearly perished. I think often of that moment when Elizabeth scratched with a diamond ring into her prison window the words, "Much suspected by me. Nothing proved can be." Such quiet defiance. It reminds me of the way we sometimes whisper to ourselves when the world cannot hear. When I brew my tea in the quiet of these long evenings, I murmur little assurances aloud, just to remind myself that I am still here, still surviving, even when no one is listening. Historians debate whether Mary truly intended to execute her younger sister. Some argue Mary was torn, struggling between her fear of Elizabeth's popularity and her reluctance to spill royal blood. But for Elizabeth, those distinctions would not have mattered. What she felt each dawn was raw uncertainty. Would the door creak open with a tray of food? Or would it open with a warrant for her death? That gnawing ambiguity can eat a soul from the inside out. And yet, Elizabeth endured. When released from the Tower, she was sent to Woodstock, another form of house arrest. There, surrounded by guards and suspicion, she honed the very tools that would one day make her formidable. Patience, restraint, the art of saying little but meaning much. I wonder if it was in those long, watchful hours that she perfected her mask. The serene, composed queen the world would later see. Masks, after all, are forged in silence. I sometimes think my own mask was shaped in the quiet after my husband's passing, when laughter felt like a language I had forgotten. I smiled for neighbors, for the postman, even for the cashier at the corner store. But alone, in the hush of my living room, I practiced stillness. Like Elizabeth, I learned that survival often requires concealment. And oh, what a turning point when Mary's death in 1558 opened the way for Elizabeth to ascend the throne. After years of being watched, doubted, and nearly destroyed, she suddenly found herself at the center of the stage, the crown pressing down upon her fiery hair. Yet even as the bells rang for her coronation, loneliness walked beside her. How could it not? Trust, for her, had been shattered too early, too often. The very walls that once confined her became invisible ramparts around her heart. It makes me think. Perhaps every ruler, and maybe every lonely soul, carries within them a secret chamber, a place where doubt whispers and fear lingers. Elizabeth survived by listening carefully, but not always revealing what she heard. It's a lesson I've tried to adopt, too. When you live alone, you hear the world differently. The rustle of trees outside, the far-off laughter from a neighbor's yard. They become reminders that the world is still alive, even when you feel forgotten. Elizabeth's prison was made of stone. Mine is made of silence. But both teach us patience. Both remind us that solitude, painful as it is, can become the training ground for resilience. And so, lovers, as we leave Elizabeth stepping into her reign, let us ask ourselves, how much of a leader's greatness is forged not in triumph, but in the crucible of their darkest, most solitary hours? When Elizabeth finally placed the crown upon her head in 1559, the bells of London rang so loudly it must have felt as though heaven itself had opened in celebration. But oh, lovers, what a crown it was! Glorious in appearance, crushing in weight. She inherited a kingdom fractured by religion, drained of coffers, and perched precariously between the ambitions of Spain and France. I sometimes wonder whether the cheering crowds drowned out the echo of doubt in her heart. For every voice that cried, "God save the Queen," there must have been another whispering, "She will not last." Even in her moment of triumph, Elizabeth must have felt that sharp loneliness, that knowledge that no one else could carry the burden she had just taken on. I think of my own small victories. When I finally managed to fix the garden fence last spring, or when I bake a pie that turns out just right. For a moment, I smile, proud. But then, inevitably, I look up and there's no one across the table to share it with. Triumph, without witness, feels incomplete. The question of marriage loomed immediately. Parliament urged her to secure an heir. Foreign courts dangled suitors like glittering baubles. Philip II of Spain, a king already widowed, offered himself, as did Archduke Charles of Austria. And closer to home, there was Robert Dudley. The favorite, the confidant, perhaps the only man Elizabeth truly loved. But to choose was to risk dividing her fragile realm. Marriage might bind England to another power, yet it might also make her appear weak. A queen dependent on a husband's authority. Here lies the paradox that has haunted her memory. Elizabeth, the Virgin Queen. Was it strength? Or was it isolation? Some say she sacrificed her womanhood for the sake of her throne. That her refusal to wed left her a prisoner of her own crown. Others argue it was her genius. The realization that as long as she remained unwed, she belonged only to England. A bride married to her nation. Do you see the brilliance in that? To turn what many saw as a flaw, her singleness, into her greatest political weapon. Every court in Europe continued to woo her. And in that delicate dance, Elizabeth kept them all guessing. All competing. Never sure who might win her hand. It was diplomacy by flirtation. And yet, when the festivities ended, when the court grew quiet, I imagine she walked back to her chambers alone. Her skirts brushing the cold stone floors. There's an ache in that image. Isn't there? Power glittering all around. And yet the bedchamber holding only silence. I know that ache all too well. The house may be filled with books, photographs, mementos. But when the day ends, it is still just me. The ticking clock on the wall becomes the only heartbeat I hear. Elizabeth wore pearls in her portraits. Symbols of purity. Yes. But also of tears. Have you ever held a pearl? It is smooth, luminous, yet born from irritation. A grain of sand transformed into beauty by layers upon layers of patient endurance. Perhaps that is why she wore them. Not just for purity's sake, but as emblems of the pain and perseverance that shaped her reign. And oh, what perseverance was required. Religious turmoil tore at her kingdom. Catholics still yearned for Rome. Protestants demanded stricter reforms. Elizabeth chose a middle path, crafting what came to be known as the Elizabethan religious settlement. Not too Catholic, Not too Protestant, but something uniquely English. It was compromise. But compromise can be lonely. When you stand between two raging fires, neither side truly calls you theirs. She had to ask herself, much as I sometimes do, what price peace? Is the quiet worth the loneliness it requires? Historians argue whether her settlement was genuine conviction or merely survival. Yet it endured, shaping England for centuries to come. Perhaps survival itself is enough of a legacy. So, lovers, as we linger with Elizabeth in those first years of her reign, let me leave you with this thought. Sometimes, the greatest power lies not in action, but in restraint. To refuse the easy choice. To hold steady in the midst of pressure. To wear the crown yet walk the corridor alone. The years that followed were a careful dance across a floor littered with daggers. Elizabeth's crown might have glittered under torchlight, but every sparkle had its shadow. Plots whispered in the dark hallways of her court. Foreign powers watched for weakness. Spain, the most formidable empire of the age, eyed England like a hawk circling a lone bird. The Pope himself declared Elizabeth illegitimate, urging Catholics to reject her rule. Imagine, lovers, the fear of waking each morning knowing that somewhere, in some quiet chapel, men were plotting your death. Elizabeth's counselors pressed her to marry, to cement an alliance, to silence the whispers that her throne was fragile. But again, she refused. She turned what many saw as vulnerability into theater. She cultivated an image. Regal. Untouchable. Half mortal. Half divine. Her portraits grew increasingly stylized. Her face smoothed. Her gaze elevated beyond the earthly. She was becoming less a woman, more a symbol. Symbols, though, do not laugh freely at the hearth. They do not slip into the comfort of another's arms. A symbol must remain always on display. And so the irony. The stronger her image, the more distant her humanity became. When I stare at those portraits in books, I sometimes sigh. The painted Elizabeth looks eternal. Yes. But lonely. A life so heavily curated leaves little room for the unguarded smile. But symbols inspire. And inspire she did. The Elizabethan age became a flowering of art and culture. Shakespeare, Marlowe, Spencer, all thrived under her reign. Plays filled the theaters. Poetry spilled from the quills of men who believed they lived in a golden age. And perhaps they did. Yet behind the glow of the stage lights, Elizabeth still faced the gnawing question. How long could she hold this fragile balance? There was Robert Dudley, ever near her side. His presence sparking rumors. His wife's suspicious death. Was it an accident? Or something darker? History still debates. But one truth is certain. Elizabeth could not afford to be seen as a woman governed by her passions. And so even if her heart leaned toward Dudley, her crown forbade it. It is here that her story begins to echo in my own quiet evenings. How many of us, I wonder, have set aside love because of duty? Not duty to a kingdom, perhaps, but to children, to aging parents, to the expectations of family or society. Sacrifices shape us, but they also hollow us out. When I think of Elizabeth pacing her chamber late at night, I can almost hear the same echo I hear in my own kitchen. The sound of a teacup set gently on the counter, with no one to lift another in response. Still, Elizabeth's restraint, her deliberate solitude, gave her an unparalleled strength. She became not just a ruler but a living embodiment of England itself. When she declared herself wedded to her people, she meant it. And perhaps, in some paradoxical way, the people filled that emptiness. Their devotion became the companion she never allowed herself to have. But one cannot live on adoration alone. As her reign lengthened, the pressures mounted. Spain gathered its might. And Mary, Queen of Scots, Elizabeth's cousin, rival, and mirror, waited in the wings. And through it all, Elizabeth remained poised, calculating, a pearl set against a turbulent sea. It makes me pause, lovers, and ask, what do we lose when we trade our humanity for our legacy? As the years unfolded, Elizabeth's crown grew heavier. The air in her court was charged, like the stillness before a storm. Spain, long her adversary, was preparing its greatest challenge. The Armada. Imagine, lovers, the tension of those days. Across the Channel, Philip II marshaled one of the largest fleets the world had yet seen. Hundreds of ships, bristling with cannons, carrying thousands of men. Their purpose was not hidden. The conquest of England, the overthrow of Elizabeth, and the restoration of Catholic rule. In those anxious weeks of 1588, Elizabeth did something extraordinary. She left the safety of her palaces and rode out to face her troops at Tilbury. Picture her. Small in stature, clad in armor that gleamed in the sun, speaking words that still stir hearts centuries later. I know I have the body of a weak and feeble woman, but I have the heart and stomach of a king. Those words were more than rhetoric. They were fire. They transformed fear into determination. Her soldiers, hardened men who might have doubted a woman's rule, cheered her with a loyalty that no foreign king could buy. For a moment, the lonely woman became a warrior queen. And history records what followed. Storms, cunning tactics, and the fierce resolve of the English navy. The Armada was scattered, defeated not just by cannons but by the will of a people who rallied behind their queen. It was perhaps her greatest triumph. A moment when she was no longer a solitary figure but the beating heart of her nation. Yet after the cheers faded, after the enemy's sails vanished on the horizon, Elizabeth returned to her solitude. Victory cannot be shared in the quiet of the night. I imagine her back in her chamber. The armor laid aside. The crown placed once again on its cushion. Who comforted her then? Who whispered to her that she had done enough? It reminds me, in my own modest way, of moments when I have faced crises alone. No armadas, of course. Just the waves of grief, of illness, of silence in this house. We all know what it is to stand before something immense, to find within ourselves a strength we never suspected, and then to return to a room that feels unbearably empty. The Armada's defeat secured her throne, but it also cemented her image as a symbol rather than a woman. The Virgin Queen, the invincible monarch, the icon of Protestant England. But beneath that legend beat a human heart, and the question lingers. Did Elizabeth ever wish to shed the armor and be simply Elizabeth? Her reign, from that moment forward, was both glorious and shadowed. The arts blossomed. Exploration expanded. England grew bold. Yet Elizabeth aged alone. Her court shifting around her as younger courtiers rose and older allies died. Time, that relentless enemy, pressed on. I often think of her standing before a mirror, seeing the lines deepen, the hair thin, the carefully painted mask of youth harder to maintain. Did she 2. Feel the ache of years pressing upon her shoulders? Did she sense that even as her legend grew, her own life was slipping quietly away? The Armada gave her immortality in history. Yes. But immortality does not hold your hand when the firelight dims. After the roaring triumph of Tilbury and the Armada's defeat, Elizabeth entered the later decades of her reign with an aura almost divine. The poets called her Gloriana, the Virgin Queen, the living embodiment of England's destiny. Yet even glory has its shadows. And the longer she lived, the more acutely those shadows pressed in. Her court was filled with pageantry, masks, plays, tournaments. But beneath the glitter there was a loneliness that could not be masked by jewels or silks. Imagine her. Lovers. Seated in the great hall. Courtiers laughing. Music swelling. And yet her eyes drifting toward the empty chair where a husband might have sat. Or toward the children she never had. She was surrounded by hundreds and yet was utterly alone. Robert Dudley, her great favorite, had long been a fixture in her life. Some whispered he was the only man she truly loved, though she never allowed herself the indulgence of marriage. His death in 1588, so soon after the Armada, struck her deeply. In her private chambers, she kept the last letter he ever wrote her, calling it her farewell. I imagine her holding that page in her hand. The ink faded but the ache fresh. Isn't it haunting? To live as a symbol for the world and yet clutch scraps of paper for comfort in the night? Her relationships with younger courtiers, Essex most of all, were equally tangled. He was dashing, bold, insolent even. Their bond, part maternal, part romantic, part political, was fraught with tension. And when Essex rose in rebellion, Elizabeth faced not just betrayal but the pain of sentencing someone she once cherished. Ordering his execution must have carved something into her soul that no crown could mend. Here I pause. And I wonder, is power worth its price? Elizabeth reigned for decades. Unchallenged. Unrivaled. But she bore that power as a solitary figure. Loved by her people but isolated from intimacy. A woman who ruled like a man, yet who could never quite escape the fact of her womanhood. Used against her. Misunderstood. Manipulated. It is the same question that echoes in my little house. Here in the silence of my evenings. What do we give up to keep control of our lives? I never wore a crown. But I sacrificed closeness in the years after my husband passed. Retreating into books and history rather than risk the messiness of human ties. Like Elizabeth, I became a fortress. And sometimes, a fortress is the loneliest place to dwell. Still, there was greatness in her solitude. The arts flourished around her. Shakespeare, Marlowe, Spencer, all weaving England's golden age. Explorers like Drake and Raleigh expanded the horizons of the world. Elizabeth presided not as a passive figurehead but as a calculating, clever sovereign, shaping the destiny of her nation. But when she withdrew into her chambers, after the plays ended and the courtiers dispersed, she was once again a woman with fading youth and growing shadows. In those moments, I cannot help but think she knew, better than anyone, that even queens cannot escape the ache of being human. Her story reminds us that history's icons are not marble statues. They are flesh and spirit, fragile and flawed, caught between the needs of a people and the hunger of their own hearts. And perhaps, when she gazed at her reflection, painted, powdered, masked, she, too, whispered the question we all ask. Who am I? When the world stops watching. By the 1590s, Elizabeth was in her 60s, an age that, in Tudor times, made her almost a miracle of survival. And yet, she clung to the throne with a grip of iron. The question of succession loomed larger than ever. She had no children, no husband, and no direct heir of her own blood. Each year that passed, the anxiety of her council deepened. What would become of England when she was gone? It is painful, lovers, to imagine what she must have felt in those final years. For decades she had been the sun, and all of England revolved around her. But the sun, too, eventually sets. Her once fiery red hair had thinned and been replaced with elaborate wigs. Her once youthful face had become a canvas of lead-based makeup, a mask to hide the ravages of age. Courtiers spoke in whispers of her mask of youth, and though they bowed low, behind their eyes they saw a fading woman. In her last years, Elizabeth was haunted not only by mortality but by betrayal. The execution of Essex in 1601 weighed heavily on her heart. When she signed his death warrant, it was as if she severed the last tether to the vibrant affections of her youth. It was said that afterward, she grew listless, retreating into her chambers, leaning more on her ladies-in-waiting than ever before. The flame that once burned so brilliantly flickered, dimmer and dimmer. And still, she refused to name a successor. Perhaps it was pride. Perhaps it was fear. Perhaps it was the impossible ache of acknowledging that the story of Elizabeth was nearing its close. The throne she had defended with every fiber of her being would one day be occupied by another. And she would be reduced to memory, to legend, to portrait. When I think of her final months, I picture her in Richmond Palace, sitting in silence for hours, staring at the floor. Her ladies tried to coax her to bed, but she would not move. She resisted, as if by sheer will she could hold back death itself. That image pierces me, because I have known the same stubbornness in myself. After my husband passed, there were nights when I refused to leave the armchair in our living room, clutching the blanket that still smelled faintly of him, as though immobility could keep grief at bay. Elizabeth finally passed in March 1603. She had ruled for 45 years, longer than any English monarch before her. The transition to James VI of Scotland was smooth, a rare mercy in those turbulent times. But Elizabeth did not live to see the new chapter. She left behind a realm transformed, stronger, more confident, entering its golden age. And yet, she left alone. Her body was placed in Westminster Abbey, and the bells tolled across London. The people mourned their queen, but none wept more bitterly than those who had served her intimately, who had witnessed not just the glitter of Gloriana but the sorrow of Elizabeth, the woman. So I ask you, as I ask myself in these quiet nights, was Elizabeth the first a symbol of unmatched power, or a woman crushed by solitude? The answer, perhaps, is both. Greatness and loneliness so often intertwine. And history, for all its grandeur, is always rooted in the fragile heart of a human being. As I trace the last whispers of Elizabeth's reign, I find myself lingering not on her victories but on her shadowed solitude. Power had been her constant companion, but it could not cradle her in the quiet hours. What a strange fate! To be surrounded by courtiers, ministers, and sycophants, and yet to die with no one truly by your side. When I look back at her story, I see how power carved both her triumph and her prison. She had ruled with an iron hand, with a sharp wit, with unmatched charisma. She was Gloriana, the Virgin Queen, adored by poets, immortalized in portraits, and invoked as England's savior. Yet beneath the paint, beneath the jewels, beneath the crown itself, there was still a woman. Elizabeth, daughter of a disgraced mother, child of a father who had once nearly erased her from succession. Perhaps she never forgot that precarity, that loneliness that had stalked her since girlhood. And isn't that true of so many of us? Lovers? That the roles we wear, the faces we show the world, hide a heart that aches to be understood. I've lived a long life. But even now, when I close my front door in the evening and silence swallows the house, I feel that same hollowness. I think of Elizabeth then. And I whispered to her across the centuries. I know what it is to feel powerful outside and empty within. Her death did not end her presence. For years, playwrights like Shakespeare had wrapped her in allegories. Her reign a living metaphor for England itself. After her passing, her myth only grew. But what of the woman behind the myth? Did she long, even once, to abandon her throne and simply be loved? Simply be Elizabeth? We will never know. And perhaps that is what makes her story ache in the marrow. Because her silence in those final hours leaves us to wonder. History remembers her as a symbol of power. But when I think of her, I also see the woman sitting stubbornly on the palace floor, refusing to be moved, staring at nothing and everything at once. A queen still, but also a soul weary with loneliness. That image lingers like a ghost. So, my dear friends, perhaps the truest legacy of Elizabeth I is not only the golden age she brought forth, but also the human reminder that power cannot shield us from solitude. It forces us to ask, what is the worth of a crown, if it cannot warm your hands in the night? As I sit here tonight, the lamp humming softly on my table, I feel that Elizabeth's story has already seeped into the walls of my little home. It presses upon me in the silence, reminding me that loneliness is not reserved for queens. It stalks us all, in grand palaces and modest kitchens alike. Elizabeth, for all her brilliance, left behind no children, no partner, no heir of her blood. When she died, her dynasty ended. The Tudor rose that had symbolized unity and renewal withered, its last petals falling quietly in the night. Can you imagine the irony? A queen whose reign brought stability, whose strength carried England into a golden age. Yet she left no one to carry her line forward. It is as though her crown was forged in gold but hollow within. Beautiful to behold yet incapable of nurturing the roots of legacy. And so, James of Scotland took the throne, stitching together England and Scotland under one crown. Some called it destiny, others betrayal of Elizabeth's vision. What would she have thought? Did she imagine her enemies smiling, whispering that the Virgin Queen left her people in the arms of another dynasty? History can be merciless in that way. Glory on one page, a question mark on the next. I often wonder, as I close a book and let the words settle in my chest, whether Elizabeth's heart truly broke in those final days. Not from illness alone, but from the crushing realization that power, so jealously guarded, cannot hold you in your last breath. She had loved her people. Yes. But they could not love her as one person does. With touch. With laughter. With closeness. The kind of love that keeps your hand steady when age steals your strength. There's a strange comfort in that reflection. Lovers. For it tells me that even the mightiest are still human. Fragile. Yearning. Undone by the same hungers that haunt us all. And perhaps it's that humanity, not her crown, that binds Elizabeth to us. She was not only a queen, She was also a woman who walked through nights of doubt, who chose power over intimacy, who paid the price of greatness with solitude. Sometimes, when I look out at the dark garden from my kitchen window, I feel like I'm meeting her gaze across time. Two women, worlds apart, yet caught in the same silence. It makes me ask, what would you choose, Eleanor? Power that builds nations, or love that builds a home? I suppose my answer has already been written in the quiet corridors of my life. The night deepens now, and my tea has gone cold. Yet here we are, together, at the final strands of Elizabeth's tale. A woman who stood taller than the kings before her, yet died with a silence that only solitude can bring. Her funeral was draped in black velvet, her coffin borne by nobles who once trembled at her wrath. The people mourned deeply, for she was their Gloriana, their sun in an age of uncertainty. And yet, was she mourned more as a symbol than as a woman? I think often of that. To be remembered not for who you are, but for what you represent. There is a heaviness to it, isn't there? The Virgin Queen was a myth, but the Elizabeth beneath it, the woman who laughed, who wept, who hesitated, was lost in the myth she herself had built. She gave everything to her crown, and in return, it took her life in slow measure, one sacrifice at a time. Sometimes, in the hush of my apartment, I wonder what Elizabeth would say if she could sit here at my kitchen table. Would she envy the quiet simplicity of a woman alone with her tea? No courtiers waiting outside, no ambassadors demanding answers? Or would she look at me with pity? Eleanor, the widow with no empire, no legacy, just memories tucked in old boxes? Perhaps we'd both smile sadly at each other, realizing that power and love are both fleeting, and in the end, we are left only with the story others tell about us. So, my dear listeners, as I close tonight's journey, I leave you with a thought. Was Elizabeth I a queen who triumphed over her loneliness? Or a woman undone by it? Perhaps the truth lies somewhere in between. History rarely gives us simple answers. It gives us mirrors. And when we gaze long enough, we see ourselves reflected back. Now, as you drift into sleep, let her story linger gently. Think of the torchlight glinting on a golden crown, and the silent tears shed behind it. For all her might, Elizabeth was, in the end, just a soul yearning for love in a world that demanded power. And now, lovers, let us slow our steps. Let the words soften, like candlelight melting into shadows. Elizabeth's story does not end in grandeur, but in a whisper. A reminder that even the brightest flame must flicker, and even the strongest heart must trust. She gave the world an empire of culture and strength, yet carried her own emptiness quietly, like a jewel hidden in velvet. It makes me think of our own lives. The choices we make, the things we surrender, the silences we bear. Do they define us? Or do they, like Elizabeth's reign, simply fold into the larger fabric of time, leaving behind traces that others may puzzle over? Whatever the answer, her story comforts me. It tells me that loneliness is not a failure, but a thread in the human tapestry. Even queens cannot escape it, and neither can we. But perhaps, in sharing these stories together, we soften its edge. So, rest now. Let dreams carry you back to palaces of gold, to wind-swept moors, to candlelit chambers where queens once paced. May the past hold you gently,